I used to think grief had a shape, a heavy coat by the door, a second pillow that stayed untouched, a cup on the shelf nobody used anymore. I thought grief looked like old things left behind. I was wrong. Grief is quieter than that. It wakes before you do. It sits with you while the kettle boils. It follows you to the shop and back. It waits by the window when evening falls. And after a while, if you let it, it begins to speak in your voice. My name is Evelyn Hart. I wake up every morning at 6, not because I still need to, not because anyone is waiting for me, not because the day offers anything I cannot do later. I wake at 6 because for 42 years, my husband did. My husband, Walter, used to say the world belonged to people who rose early. He said it while tying his tie, while buttering toast, while searching for his keys, while light slipped through the curtains and made the kitchen look warmer than it really was. I believed him once. Now the mornings belong to silence. Walter has been gone for 3 years. People were kind at first. That is what people do when death is fresh. They arrive with flowers, casseroles, soft voices, wet eyes, and careful hands on your shoulder. They tell you he was a good man. They tell you to call if you need anything. They tell you time will help. Then their own lives call them back, and yours does not. After a few weeks, they stopped coming. I was left with his old wool coat near the door, his slippers tucked beneath the armchair, and a heart that did not understand why it had been told to keep beating. I did not fall apart dramatically. No, I became organized. That is how some women survive. I built my days out of rules so small they could not betray me. Monday for laundry, Tuesday for windows, Wednesday for bills, Thursday for dusting, Friday for the shop, Saturday for changing the sheets, Sunday for pretending the week had meant something. Every morning at 8, I walked to the same corner store. I bought the same bread, the same milk, the same tea. I checked the prices even though I had enough money. Not because I needed to, because noticing things gave shape to time. I have always noticed things. Who closes their curtains too early, who lets their bins overflow, who parks badly, who slams doors, who says thank you and who never does. Some people in the neighborhood called me difficult. I preferred careful. Careful women survive things careless women do not. That was how I lived, not happily, just precisely. And then, one gray morning in late November, the moving truck arrived next door. I saw it from my kitchen window. A silver van first, then a larger truck, then noise, always noise. A man climbed out of the driver's seat, tall and confused-looking, as if he had already made 3 wrong choices before breakfast. A woman came next, carrying a baby on one hip and a bag on the other shoulder. Then 2 little girls burst out from the back seat like they had been made of sunlight and sugar and poor decisions. They ran in circles on the pavement, shouting over each other while the man tried to open the truck and the woman tried to stop the baby from eating something off the sleeve of her own coat. I remember staring at them with my tea halfway to my lips. They looked exhausting. They looked alive. I hated them immediately for that. Or maybe not them. Maybe I hated the sound of life arriving where silence had finally settled. That first night I heard their laughter through the wall. Not just noise, laughter. The kind that bounces off furniture, spills down hallways, makes rooms feel too full. I turned up the television. It didn't help. You cannot really cover life with volume. You can only make yourself lonely more loudly. The next morning, I went outside to sweep the front path. I always swept the front path after breakfast, whether it needed it or not. The older one from next door saw me first. She had 2 missing front teeth and hair that looked permanently surprised. She waved. Children wave as if the world has not yet taught them embarrassment. I pretended not to notice. Then she waved again. So I gave the smallest nod possible, a nod so restrained I believed it could not count as kindness. It counted. Her whole face lit up. That should have warned me. That is how it begins sometimes. Not with love, not with hope, not with any dramatic revelation. With one small nod. A few days later, I saw the young mother. Her name, I later learned, was Mara, standing beside her car with a flat tire and a baby balanced against her chest, while the 2 girls argued over whose fault the universe was. I watched from behind the curtain. I told myself it was none of my business. Then I saw her trying to lower the jack while the baby cried, and one of the girls wandered too close to the street. My chest tightened with irritation. At her, at the children, at the whole impossible sight, and then, traitorously, at myself. Walter would have helped. He was that kind of man, the kind who fixed things before he was asked, the kind who took strangers seriously, the kind who never believed himself too burdened to notice someone else's trouble. I stood there angry at him for being dead, and angry at myself for knowing exactly what he would have done. Then I put on my coat and went outside. She looked startled when I offered help, as if I were the last person she expected to cross the distance between our houses. "Thank you," she said 3 times in under a minute. "It's only a tire," I said. But inside, it did not feel like only a tire. After that, they began greeting me every morning. The woman was Mara. Her husband was Daniel. The girls were June and Elsie. The baby was Theo. I learned all this accidentally, I told myself. I did not ask. I simply heard and remembered. I still claimed I wanted nothing to do with them. But I began to notice when they left the house, when they returned, which child cried louder, which one ran faster, how the husband always forgot his lunch on Wednesdays, how the mother sometimes stood in the doorway after everyone else had gone, breathing like she had already lived an entire day before 9 o'clock. One afternoon, I found a drawing pushed beneath my door. It was a picture done in green and blue crayon, a woman with gray hair, a black cat beside her, a crooked little heart floating above both. On top, in shaky letters, it said, "To our kind neighbor." I smiled before I could stop myself. That frightened me more than anything so far. Not because the drawing mattered, because it did. I put it on the refrigerator. Then I stood there staring at it for far too long, as if some stranger had entered my kitchen and rearranged the air. Winter deepened. The mornings grew harder. The dark came early. Cold settled into the bones of the house. This was always the season when Walter's absence felt most physical. The cold made memories sharper. I remembered his hands around warm coffee mugs, his scarf hanging crookedly, the way he rubbed warmth into his fingers before opening the front gate on icy mornings. And because winter sharpens loneliness, it also sharpens dangerous thoughts. Months earlier, I had made a plan, a quiet one, a neat one. I had written letters, one to the solicitor, one to the utility office, one to no one in particular, because sometimes women who have spent their whole lives being practical even prepare their exit carefully. I kept those letters in the back drawer of the sideboard under the old tablecloths. I told no one. Not because no one would have stopped me, because I no longer wanted stopping, only ending. But every time I thought the right night had come, something interrupted me. A knock from next door, a child's laugh through the wall, soup left on my doorstep because Mara made too much, a silly drawing, a question shouted over the fence, a snowman collapsing in their yard while the girls shrieked with delight. Little interruptions, tiny threads, enough to delay disappearance. One afternoon, Mara knocked in a rush. Her husband had taken a fall at work. "Nothing terrible," she said too fast, which meant frightening but survivable. She had to go to the hospital. Could I watch the girls for 2 hours? My first instinct was no. I had not been responsible for children in decades. I had not even felt responsible for myself in months, but she looked so tired. And because tiredness recognizes itself in others, I stepped aside and said yes. The girls entered my house like weather. Too loud, too curious, too alive. They touched everything, asked questions without waiting for answers. June wanted to know why I had so many teacups. Elsie wanted to know whether the cat had always disliked people. Theo slept in the carrier for 20 minutes and then woke furious with life. I made tea, too much sugar by accident. They called it perfect. At some point, one of them laughed so hard milk came out through her nose, and for one startling second, I heard my own laugh answer hers. When Mara returned that evening, exhausted and relieved and nearly crying from gratitude, she hugged me before I could stop her. "You're wonderful," she whispered. Wonderful. I almost told her she was mistaken. That wonderful women do not write goodbye letters. That wonderful women do not stand in dark kitchens imagining silence as relief. But instead, I said, "He'll be all right." She nodded. "Just bruised, nothing broken." After they left, I stood in the center of my living room and listened. The house felt different, not healed, not transformed, but stirred. The girls had left paper and crayons on the coffee table. One drawing showed 2 houses side by side. In one house, their family stood waving. In the other, a woman with gray hair and a cat stood smiling. I took a pen and wrote my name under the woman. Evelyn. It had been a long time since my name looked like it belonged to someone still living. That night, I opened the drawer and took out the letter I had written for no one. I read it again. Then I folded it carefully and put it back. Not because I had changed my mind forever, only because for the first time in many months, I did not want to finish what it began. Maybe later, I told myself. Maybe in spring. Maybe when the weather softened. But deep down, something quieter and truer had already begun whispering. Maybe not at all. The next morning, I woke before the alarm. The house was still quiet, but the silence felt different. Softer. I opened the curtains and saw June and Elsie already outside with their scarves half on and their shoes untied, waving at me like they had been waiting. I waved back properly that time. They jumped up and down as if I had given them the moon. And something inside my chest, something I thought had died with Walter, shifted. Not healed, but moved. That is how life returns sometimes. Not in miracles, in repetitions, a wave, a knock, a drawing, a child saying your name as if it matters. The weeks after that passed faster than grief usually allows. Mara began dropping by with slices of cake, mismatched magazines, stories from the hospital where she worked, and apologies for talking too much. I told her she didn't talk too much. I only thought it sometimes. Daniel, once his leg healed, started repairing little things around their house badly enough that I often stood at the fence correcting him. He took the criticism cheerfully, which was suspicious. The girls came and went through my gate so often that Rosie, my old black cat, stopped pretending outrage and accepted them with the bitter dignity of a queen forced to tolerate peasants. And I, against all previous design, began to matter again. Not grandly, practically. I watered their plants when they were away, collected parcels, minded the children, mended a torn coat, found a lost shoe, made broth when Theo had a fever, stood on a chair and changed a light bulb because Daniel was somehow less competent at that than any adult male should be. Purpose returned in fragments, and purpose, I learned, is often what pulls a person back from the edge more effectively than comfort ever could. One evening, Mara invited me to dinner. I refused at first. Of course I did. Women like me always refuse at first. It allows us to preserve the illusion that we are choosing distance rather than merely inhabiting it. She insisted. So I stood in front of my wardrobe for 10 ridiculous minutes, wondering what one wears to be a guest in the life that accidentally saved her. I chose a clean navy sweater and brushed my hair twice. Their house smelled of garlic, bread, and young chaos. The girls pulled me toward the table. Theo banged a spoon against a bowl as if conducting an orchestra. Daniel offered me wine with the seriousness of a man inviting royalty. I told myself I would stay 1 hour. I stayed all evening. After dinner, the girls showed me their room, full of crayons, socks, storybooks, stuffed animals, and the holy disorder of childhood. They laughed with the complete confidence of creatures who still believe the world will keep answering them kindly. I stood there in that bright, noisy room and realized something painful and beautiful at once. I had spent 3 years protecting my grief like it was the last true thing I owned. I had mistaken isolation for loyalty, as though loving Walter properly meant withdrawing from all future warmth. I went home that night and stood in the dark hallway for a long time before turning on the light. The house was still mine, still quiet, still marked by him, but it no longer felt like a tomb. It felt like a place waiting to be used again. That is different, and differences matter. After that, life changed in increments too small to fear. I opened the curtains earlier. I planted bulbs in the garden. I repaired Walter's old radio and let it crackle through the mornings. I began walking farther. I noticed the bakery's warm smell at 7:30, the old man feeding pigeons near the square, the woman at the library who always wore bright scarves, the way sunlight looked on the pavement after rain. All the things grief had flattened into background returned to the front of life again. Not because the grief left, because it moved aside enough for other things to stand with it. There were still bad days. Some mornings I woke reaching toward Walter's side of the bed. Some evenings I sat at the kitchen table and cried without warning or useful reason. Sometimes I saw a man in a dark coat from behind, and for one irrational second believed the world had reversed itself. But I no longer fought the grief. I let it come. I let it go. It was a tide now, not a prison. Then spring arrived, and with it the old oak at the end of the street came under threat. A notice from the council said it would be removed. Unsafe, they claimed. Too old, too damaged, risk to the road. That tree had stood there longer than most of the houses. Walter loved it. He used to say old things deserved patience. I walked down to see the notice nailed to the trunk and felt fury rise in me like heat. Not because it was only a tree, because it was memory, because it had stood while so much else fell, because sometimes one small thing becomes the place where all your remaining tenderness gathers. I went home and wrote a letter. A real one. Not a goodbye letter. A fighting letter. I wrote about the history of the tree, the families who had grown beneath it, the shade it gave in summer, the birds that nested there, the need to protect old things before replacing them thoughtlessly with newer, emptier versions. Mara read it and said, "This is brilliant." I laughed and told her no one cared what an old widow thought. She said, "You'd be surprised." The local paper published it. My name appeared in print. Evelyn Hart of Linden Street writes. I stood in the kitchen holding that page so tightly it shook. For years, I believed my voice had ended with Walter's death. There it was, still capable of reaching beyond my own walls. People began stopping me in the street. Some thanked me, some remembered Walter, some wanted to help. Soon there were signatures, a petition, children drawing the tree and hanging pictures in the library window. The girls from next door called me a hero, which I told them was nonsense, but not very convincingly. We won. The council agreed to keep the oak. The neighborhood celebrated with tea and biscuits and far too much optimism. And something inside me continued to unfold. I began helping at the library once a week with children's reading hour. At first, I only agreed because the librarian was desperate, and Mara said I would be perfect. I insisted I would not. I was. Children, I discovered, do not care whether your heart was once broken if your voice can make stories feel alive. Summer came early. The garden bloomed. The girls spent afternoons on my lawn drawing impossible animals in chalk. Daisy, yes, a second cat had since wandered into my life and refused to leave, slept beneath the lavender while Rosie pretended outrage from the windowsill. I started writing small notes at night about my days. Nothing grand, just fragments. June lost a tooth. Theo said my name clearly. The roses opened. I laughed at dinner. Today I did not feel afraid of tomorrow. Then, in late August, fire came. Not to my house, to the oak. A group of foolish teenagers lit something near the trunk and walked away before it was dead. By the time anyone noticed, smoke was already twisting into the evening air. We all ran to the street. The firefighters came quickly, but not quickly enough. By the time the flames were out, half the tree was blackened and split. I stood among my neighbors with ash in the air and tears on my face. The tree we had fought to save was gone anyway, not from age, not from weather, from carelessness. That night, grief returned in an old form, not because of the tree alone, because loss is a collector. One loss wakes another. Walter. The letters. The years wasted in silence. The sudden reminder that anything loved can still disappear. I sat awake until dawn. Then, in the pale morning, I walked back to the park. The ground was gray with ash. The tree stood wounded, broken, but still partly upright. I reached down, picked up a burnt piece of bark, and carried it home. I placed it beside Walter's photograph, a reminder. Not that everything dies, that what matters can still matter after it breaks. When Mara came over later, she looked at my face and said softly, "We can plant something new." And we did. That weekend, the whole street came out. We cleared the ground and planted a young oak in its place. The girls insisted it should be called Walter's tree. No one argued. When the last shovel of earth went down, people clapped. I cried. But they were not empty tears. They were living tears, the kind that arrive when pain is finally standing beside love instead of replacing it. After that, something settled permanently inside me. Not happiness, something better. Belonging. By autumn, I no longer counted my life in chores and survival. I counted it in visits, library afternoons, shared meals, weeds pulled from the flower beds, children's birthdays, handwritten notes, and the sound of my own name spoken warmly by people who expected to see me tomorrow. One evening, I took the old goodbye letters from the drawer and read them all. They were neat, controlled, polite. They sounded like a woman who believed her life had already ended and only her body had failed to notice. I was grateful to her, truly, because she endured. She stayed long enough to see another version of the world. Then I tore the letters into small pieces and let them fall into the bin like dry leaves. I did not feel dramatic. I felt done. At Christmas, the family next door invited me for dinner again. The girls handed me a card covered in glitter that read, "We love you, Miss Evelyn." I placed it beside Walter's photograph on the mantel. Later that night, after the dishes were done and the children were half asleep with sugar and joy, I stepped outside alone. Snow was falling softly. The new oak stood bare and small and stubborn. The street glowed gold beneath the lamps. I thought about the woman I had been, the one who believed silence was permanent, the one who thought love ended when the person did, the one who mistook survival for the end of the story. I wish I could tell her what I know now, that love does not disappear. It changes shape. Sometimes it becomes memory, sometimes routine, sometimes the courage to get out of bed again, sometimes a child's drawing pushed under your door, sometimes a neighbor asking for help, sometimes a family loud enough to interrupt your plans to vanish, sometimes a new tree planted where an old one burned. Love stays, not always in the form you expected, but it stays. That night I went back inside, fed both cats, turned off the kitchen light and sat in Walter's chair by the window. The house was warm, not loud, not full, just warm. For the first time in years, the silence around me did not feel heavy. It felt peaceful. And that is how I knew I was home again.